You know, when you brought this topic to the table, the Rwandan genocide, I can be honest, it's one of those things that just sticks with you, you know? Like, how could something that awful actually happen? And even more importantly, could anything have been done to stop it?
It's a question that kind of haunts all of us, doesn't it? The deeper you dig into the events leading up to it, the more you realize it wasn't some unavoidable tragedy. There were so many points where things could have gone differently.
Totally. So let's take it back a bit. Before 1994, before the genocide happened, I think a lot of our listeners probably picture Rwanda as this just inherently divided nation, you know? Like the Hutu and Tutsi conflict was just waiting to explode.
Yeah, that's a common misconception, but the truth is way more complicated. Pre-colonial Rwanda did have some social distinctions between Hutu and Tutsi, sure, but it wasn't this strict racially charged system that we saw fueling the genocide. It was more about their roles in society and economics, with a lot more fluidity between those groups. And then, well, the Belgians enter the picture.
And that's where things get really messed up, right? What was this engineered division you mentioned?
Okay, so picture this. Belgium, with their colonial ambitions, they decide to impose a racial hierarchy on Rwanda. They pick out the Tutsi minority and declare them as just naturally superior. And the basis for this, it's wild pseudoscientific measurements of their skulls and even how wide their noses were. They handed power and privilege over to the Tutsi, pushing the Hutu majority to the margins. It's not hard to imagine the resentment, the division this created, right?
It's like they took a society that was figuring things out, finding its balance, and injected it with pure poison.
Exactly. And that poison, that manufactured hate, it stuck around, it festered for decades. Even after Belgium left Rwanda in '62, they basically created a powder keg, and well, in 1994 it blew.
And we know that explosion was sparked by a horrific event, the assassination of President Habyarimana. But this is where the whole what if thing comes in, right?
Absolutely. We can't change the past, but we can look at these major moments and think, what if things had gone differently? Like, when Habyarimana was assassinated, there were still negotiations happening with the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF. Had he lived, maybe those talks could have led to a more peaceful way to hand over power. No guarantees, of course, but it shows how, even with all that tension, there were other paths possible.
So it wasn't a guarantee. Tragically, though, those paths weren't taken, and things in Rwanda kept getting worse and worse. And you can't talk about this without talking about the role of hate speech, can you?
No, you really can't. The Hutu power movement, with people like Theoneste Bagosora leading the charge, they used those existing ethnic tensions, and the radio, specifically RTLM, that was their tool to spread their hate-filled ideology.
And RTLM, for anyone who doesn't know, it wasn't just sharing political views or opinions. It was like they were dumping gasoline straight onto a fire.
That's a chillingly accurate way to put it. Imagine turning on the radio and you're hearing your neighbors, people you work with, even your own government calling you a cockroach that needs to be wiped out. That was the reality for Tutsis in Rwanda in those months before the genocide. That wasn't free speech. That was straight up inciting violence on a massive scale.
It's just horrifying how words can be twisted like that, how they can fuel so much hate and violence. And the truly sad part is that the Rwandan genocide wasn't one of those things where nobody saw it coming. There were people who knew, trying to sound the alarm. And that's where the story of General Romeo Dallaire comes in. He's the commander of the UN peacekeeping forces in Rwanda, and his story is both really brave and utterly heartbreaking.
It really is. Dallaire's story is one of incredible courage, but also tragic helplessness. I mean, here he was, leading UNAMIR, that's the UN assistance mission for Rwanda, receiving reliable intelligence that there was a plan to exterminate the Tutsi population. He was even given specific locations where they were storing weapons. Can you believe that? Dallaire knew how serious this was.
He did.
He pleaded with the UN, begging for reinforcements, a mandate to intervene, anything that could stop this disaster from happening.
And the world just... they didn't listen.
Pretty much. The UN, stuck in its bureaucracy, political games, and this paralyzing fear of something they called mission creep, they refused to give Dallaire what he needed. Imagine being Dallaire in those desperate months, knowing what was coming, having some way, maybe, to stop it, but being held back by a world that just didn't care enough. It shows how empty good intentions are without the will to back them up with action.
That right there has got to be one of history's biggest what-ifs. What if, because of Dallaire's warnings, the UN had stepped in, intervened with real strength? Could they have prevented the genocide? Or at least could they have stopped it from being so horrific, so widespread?
It's impossible to know for sure, but it's definitely possible. If the UN had been there, a real presence, ready and allowed to protect people, who knows how things could have gone. Dallaire himself figured that with just 5,000 well-equipped troops, he could have made a difference. A real difference.
Makes you think about the true cost of doing nothing, doesn't it?
Ooh.
All those lives lost, the suffering, because the world hesitated. And it wasn't just on the UN to act, was it? The US, we were a global superpower. We played a pretty controversial role in this too.
Yeah. Back then, the US did not want to call what was happening in Rwanda a genocide. They knew the word meant something, that it came with obligations, pressure to actually intervene. There's this chilling quote from a US State Department spokesperson. When they asked him about it, what was going on, he said, "We have every reason to believe that acts of genocide have occurred in Rwanda." They knew, but they wouldn't say the word. Protecting themselves politically was more important than saving lives. It's sickening.
It's hard to even process that. While hundreds of thousands of people were being murdered, systematically slaughtered, the biggest powers in the world were worried about what words to use instead of actually doing something.
It just goes to show how messed up global politics can be. Language, even in the face of unspeakable horror, can be twisted and used as a weapon.
We've talked a lot about what could have stopped the Rwandan genocide, but it happened. The RPF, led by Paul Kagame, they won, they ended the genocide. So what came next? What impact did their victory have? And what other outcomes could we imagine for those years right after the genocide?
The RPF's victory, yeah, it stopped the immediate killing, but it brought its own set of complicated issues. Try to imagine inheriting a country shattered by genocide. That was Kagame and the RPF's reality. Rebuilding Rwanda from basically nothing, trying to encourage reconciliation while also dealing with this immense trauma, this incredible loss.
It's hard to even comprehend a challenge on that scale. So how'd they handle it? Did they manage to find a way to balance justice with reconciliation?
It's complicated. On the one hand, Rwanda, with Kagame in charge, they made incredible progress, rebuilding their economy, infrastructure, you name it. They also put in a lot of effort to try and mend relationships between the Hutu and Tutsi communities.
There's always a but, right?
Right. While they were able to create some stability and grow their economy, Kagame's rule, well, it's had some authoritarian tendencies. There are real concerns about political oppression, limits on free speech, and a real lack of democracy. It's tough to face, but even a country recovering from something as awful as genocide, they can still struggle with basic rights and freedoms.
Sounds like another one of those crucial turning points. What if, and I know hindsight is 20/20, but what if the world, after messing up so badly before the genocide, had stepped in and taken a more active role in shaping Rwanda after it ended?
It's an interesting thought. Imagine if the UN, having learned from their mistakes, went in with a strong peacekeeping force. Not just to keep the peace, but to actively oversee how power changed hands in Rwanda.
You're talking about like the UN running the country for a little while.
Maybe. Or they could have helped create a power-sharing agreement, something negotiated by people from outside, making sure both Hutu and Tutsi voices were heard in the new government. We can't go back in time, but thinking about these alternatives helps us understand just how complex intervention is, how complicated it is to try and rebuild a nation after such horrific violence.
It's important to remember, too, that the Rwandan genocide wasn't a tragedy that stayed within Rwanda's borders. The consequences, the ripple effects, they were felt far and wide. The refugee crisis alone proves that.
Absolutely. It was one of the biggest, fastest mass displacements of people in recent history. Think about it. Millions of Rwandans running for their lives, flooding into neighboring countries, desperate for any kind of safety, any kind of shelter.
And it wasn't just people trying to escape the violence, right? This wave of refugees, it included the people who actually did it, the ones responsible for the killings. They crossed those same borders, trying to hide among the very people they had terrorized.
It's true, and that's where the international community, already struggling with the fact that they failed to prevent this whole thing, they faced another choice. Would they actually hold the people who did this accountable, or would justice be another victim?
You're saying that they had a chance to make sure the people behind the genocide didn't just disappear into the refugee camps and get away with it?
Exactly. This was their chance to show that even in all the chaos, even after something so horrible, justice still matters. But that's not what happened.
Another missed opportunity, then.
Yeah, it really was. The world, they were overwhelmed with this huge refugee crisis, and they were slow to react. They just didn't get how dangerous those camps were becoming, how the people who carried out the genocide, they were often the ones in control, still spreading fear and violence.
And that takes us right to the Congo Wars, doesn't it? Because not dealing with the situation in those camps, it had terrible consequences that went way beyond Rwanda.
There's a straight line you can draw between those things. Those genocidaires being in those camps, still targeting Tutsis, it threw the whole Great Lakes region into chaos. It was a powder keg waiting to explode, and that's exactly what happened with the First and Second Congo Wars. Millions of people died, and the trauma, the instability, it lasted for years.
So the Rwandan genocide, as awful as it was like the start of a chain reaction of violence and suffering that's just spread throughout the region.
It's true, and it shows just how crucial it is to act. Doing nothing, whether it's not preventing something like this from happening or not going after the root causes, it has a real cost, a cost that's paid for far beyond the initial crisis.
It's heavy stuff to think about, all these points where things could have been different, all the what-ifs that come with this part of history. But we have to face these hard truths, don't we? We have to learn from the mistakes that were made, even though it's painful.
We absolutely do, because when we remember the Rwandan genocide, when we understand what caused it and how the world failed to stop it, we can't just dwell on the past. We have to see the warning signs, recognize what happens when people are indifferent, and then use that to act differently when we see these things happening again.
So what can we as individuals really do? It's easy to feel powerless when something like the Rwandan genocide happens, something so huge and overwhelming.
It's understandable to feel that way, but it's a dangerous trap, that feeling of being powerless. Remember what General Dallaire said? He saw it happen. He said, the world must not only hear, but it must listen, and then it must act. That's a call to action for everyone, not just governments or organizations.
So just knowing, just feeling empathy, that's not enough. It's about taking those feelings and doing something. What does that even look like in everyday life?
Start with learning. Understand why this happened. Prejudice, discrimination, all the hateful things people say. When we see injustice, whether it's in our own backyard or on the other side of the world, we have to call it out. We can support groups working to prevent these kinds of atrocities, hold our leaders responsible, and use our voices to fight for a better world, a kinder world.
That's a lot of responsibility, but it has to be done. Because for all the darkness the Rwandan genocide shows us, all the horrible things humans are capable of, it also shows our capacity for compassion, for bravery, and for making a real change.
That's right. Maybe that's the most important thing to take away from this whole conversation. We can't change what happened, but we can learn from it. We can honor the people who were lost in Rwanda, not just with words, but with action. We can dedicate ourselves to building a future where never again isn't just something we say, but a promise we keep fighting for every day.
It's a fight worth having. This has been a tough one, but so important. Thank you for taking us on this deep dive.
Thank you for having me. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this journey. It was tough at times, but so necessary. Remember, knowing isn't enough. We have to act. Learn from the past, and let's work together to create a future without genocide.